CARES Act, What CAM Members Need to Know, presented by Butzel. During this morning's presentation, please feel free to submit questions to our presenters using the GoToWebinar control panel. Our presenters will answer as many questions, including any questions previously submitted through the CAM survey at the end of the webinar, time permitting. Also, a copy of this presentation will be made available this afternoon on our webinar event page and on Butzel's Coronavirus Resource Center on butzel.com. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our panelists from Butzel. We have Eric Flesland, Mike Decker, and Paul Mercino from our Construction Law Practice Group, Bernie Foos from our Non-Compete, Trade Secret, and PPP team, Justin Klimko from our Corporate Law and PPP team, Brett Miller from Labor and Employment, Deb Giroux from our Healthcare team, and Suzanne Miller from our Tax Law Practice Group. Thank you, panelists, for participating. I will now pass the presentation on to Mike Decker. Mike?
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We are excited to have you with us today. As Jonathan indicated, my name is Mike Decker. I'm an attorney and shareholder with Butzel. Some of you may be familiar with Butzel. Perhaps you are clients, perhaps you have dealt with Butzel in the past, or perhaps you visited the coronavirus page on CAM's website and seen the link to our website and our own coronavirus page and visited the same. For those of you who are not familiar with Butzel, we are a law firm with offices in Detroit, Bloomfield Hills, Ann Arbor, and Lansing, as well as offices in DC, Washington, D.C., and New York. We have over 100 attorneys practicing virtually all areas of law, whether it be construction, labor and employment, corporate, real estate, tax, you name it. We probably have someone who deals with it. My practice is focused on construction law, as is the practice of my two colleagues with us today, Eric Flesland and Paul Mercino. If you or your companies ever have any construction-related questions, please don't hesitate to contact myself, Eric, or Paul. But what we are here for today, obviously, is the CARES Act. In the past couple of years, CAM has been kind enough to run a couple articles that I've authored in various construction related topics, either on its website or in its magazine, with the most recent being an article I authored about the impacts of the coronavirus on the construction industry and plans and procedures for folks in the construction company to minimize those impacts. That article led Kevin Kohler and I to start talking about CAM and Butzel hosting a coronavirus related presentation for CAM members. That was just around the time that the CARES Act came out, and Kevin informed me that he was getting a lot of questions from membership about the CARES Act. So we thought a presentation on the CARES Act would be of interest and would answer a lot of the questions that Kevin was receiving. And so that's what we intend to do today, provide you with a presentation on the CARES Act and hopefully answer some of those questions that you have. That presentation will be conducted by three of my colleagues, Justin Klimko, an attorney and shareholder in our Detroit office, as well as Butzel's CEO and president, and a member of Butzel's board. Bernie Foos, an attorney and shareholder in our Detroit office, and a vice president of Butzel and a member of Butzel's board, and Brett Miller, an attorney and shareholder in our Detroit office. Also joining us today, as Jonathan indicated, is Deb Giroux, an attorney and shareholder in our Bloomfield Hills office, whose practice focuses on healthcare law, and Susan Miller, an attorney in our Bloomfield Hills office, whose practice focuses on tax law. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Justin, Bernie, and Brett for our presentation today.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Bernie Foos, and I am going to talk about just an overall 30,000-foot view of the CARES Act. It is the largest rescue, stimulus, you name the word, package in American history. And frankly, it's been the fastest piece of legislation in American history, at least in my opinion. And here's just a quick breakdown of the numbers. You guys have probably seen it. in the newspapers, on the TV. $2 trillion. That's a lot of money. 600 billion for the individuals, 500 billion for the big ticket, larger corporations. But really the focus on this presentation is that 377 billion, 349 of that has been allocated to the Paycheck Protection Program. Certainly the most popular talked about aspect of the CARES Act. I put a little asterisk there. Republicans and the Democrats have been discussing potentially adding more money. We thought there might be 250 billion that was going to be added to this fund last Thursday. Of course, as it happens with Congress, things stalled, and that has not been done yet. But I expect something will happen in some shape or form in short order. But we're going to continue to monitor that and certainly update you accordingly. So let's focus on the Paycheck Protection Program. Myself, Justin, and Brett, we're going to focus on 5 big questions. 1, who is eligible? Some of you on this webinar may have already applied, are in the process of applying. Some of you may not have. If you haven't and you are eligible, to me, you got to get in line as quickly as possible to make sure you can get a piece of the action. We'll talk about what that loan can be used for. We'll also talk about, will that loan be forgiven? That is a tricky process. At a high level, the idea is yes, all of it could be forgiven. It could be that, quote, free money, end quote. But there are some things that you need to comply with, some nuances, and Justin will tackle that. I'll go over the process. I don't want to get too legalese for everybody. What's the process, practically speaking, to get this thing across the 1-yard line into the end zone? And then some practical questions. Most of you obviously are employers. You've got people that you're concerned about. You're considering furloughs, RIFs, layoffs. Some of you may have already done those. How does the PPP program, how do you reconcile that with maybe some potential employment action you have taken or are considering? So who is eligible? It's 2 prongs. Most folks focus on the first, and I'll go over that, but there's a sneaky second that I'll get into as well that you have to be aware of. Number 1, if you're a business, a startup, a veterans organization, a nonprofit, certainly all you construction companies out there, if you're 500 employees in the US, or you would be, generally speaking, eligible to have an application and file it with your bank and get a PPP loan. There is a caveat though. If you have more than 500 employees, this is prong 2, you're not necessarily excluded, okay? There may be some light at the end of the tunnel. Under the definition under the Act, which is linked to the Small Business Administration, if you have a certain NAICS code, that is a 6-digit code that you can find on the first page of your Michigan tax return. If you qualify for a certain category, your small business definition could be 1,000, it could be 1,500, or you could be stuck at the 500 number. But if you're over that 500 mark, there may be a few of you on this webinar, that is something you really want to explore right off the bat. You're not necessarily blocked from being eligible because you're over 500. There may be some light depending on the code that you have. And certainly our team here at Butzel can easily help look into that for you and see if you do qualify in that regard. I got a beware provision here though that you just need to be careful of, whether you're under 500 or maybe a little over 500 in the United States. You have to be careful of the affiliation rule. What that means is if you have a parent, for example, or some brother or sister companies, all domestic and foreign affiliates are included in your employee eligibility calculation. So what does that mean, Bernie? If you've got, let's say, 300 employees on average in 2019 and into this year, okay, and you have a parent and some other subs with common ownership, and they've got 300 employees as well, your number for determining if you are eligible for this loan would be $600. It is complicated, it's nuanced. They call it this affiliation rule. It's confused a lot of people out there. We've navigated those waters and have been able to guide a number of clients through that process and given them comfort, whether they're eligible or not. But it does throw a layer of caution into all of this. Your corporate structure tree can really be used against you, at least for determining your eligibility. When it comes to the loan itself, you certainly stick to your company and the employees and those numbers. But again, for eligibility purposes, there is a dash of guilt by association, depending on how big your corporate structure is. And again, I don't want to get into the details too much, but we can certainly help you navigate those waters if you've got a big corporate tree structure. Another question we got, by the way, is, hey, can I form a new entity and apply for the loan that way? No. Okay. You need to have at least been in operation since February 15th, 2020. Let's talk about the loan size. How is that determined? Under the PPP, you can get a maximum loan of $1 million. Most folks that we've been dealing with in the small and mid-sized business category have been slightly under that, if not significantly under that. But generally speaking, the loan it's your total monthly payroll costs over the last 12 months. You can use 2019 or you can use a rolling 12 months. You take that monthly average and you multiply it by 2.5, and that would be your loan eligibility number. So let's say you had a payroll cost of $300,000. You times that by 2.5. 300 plus 300 is 600 plus another 150. You're at $750,000 you might be eligible for relative to this program. What is included in payroll costs? You can include the compensation, those are the salary, wages, commissions, bonuses you might pay your people. You can include payment for vacation, parental, medical, or sick leave. You can include severance that you paid in that 12-month period. You can include healthcare benefits and insurance premiums in that. And you can also include state and local tax if they were assessed on the employee comp. Of course, there are some things that are not included. The biggest piece I can give you is if you have employees or owners who make over $100,000 in salary, wages, or bonuses, you can still use those people for your calculation. You just have them individually at $100,000. So let's say you got 10 employees, 8 of them make $100,000 or less. Those would all count. And you got 2 employees who make $150 or maybe 200 grand. You can still use them, but in your spreadsheet, you got to cap them out at $100,000. Another question is, does the benefits that I pay these folks, the health insurance benefits, count towards that 100K cap? And the quick answer to that is no, we don't think it does. And most folks have not been including that. You can include their health care, their benefits in a separate bucket and count all of it towards your payroll costs, and it won't be attributed to that $100,000 cap. So if you've got someone who makes $90,000 and let's say their piece of the benefit pie is $30,000, you can still use that. You just put it into the health insurance, health benefit bucket, and you still include that person's salary up to 90K. So it's not a situation where they're at 120 and you got to exclude 20 grand from your entire calculation when it's that 90 grand and 30 grand. Hopefully that makes some sense. And certainly as you go through that process, if you haven't done it already, we can help guide you in that regard. What can you use the loan for? Well, you're using it for the payroll cost for the calculation. You can use the loan and use the money for those same payroll costs. You can also use it. There are some catches on this, and Justin will go over it from the forgiveness standpoint. But if you get this loan, let's say it was 750 grand, you can use it to pay your people to pay their health insurance, to pay their benefits. You could also use it to a certain extent for the payment of interest if you have any mortgage obligations. You can use it to pay your rent. to the extent you got brick and mortar rent that you have to pay. You can use it to pay utilities, and you can also use it to pay interest on any other pre-existing debt that you incurred before February 15th, 2020. So you can use it in many different ways, whether it turns into the quote free money, end quote, which is what catches everybody's eyes on this program. Topic, that's the forgiveness component, and that's what Justin Klimko is going to get into right now.
Thank you, Bernie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Justin Klimko, and I am going to talk about loan forgiveness. So as Bernie indicated, there's good news in the sense that there are loans available under the PPP loan provisions. There's additional good news in the sense that if you have one of these loans, you may be eligible to have part or all of the loan forgiven so that you don't have to pay it back at all. Now, as I discuss this, I want to just give a little caveat. There are a number of things in this area that are still evolving. The CARES Act, if you've looked at it, it's 335 single-spaced pages, and it appears to have been put together by a congressional staffer in a single morning while he was riding the subway to work. There are a lot of inconsistencies, there are some anomalies, and there's a fair amount of what does that mean included within the act. So in terms of loan forgiveness, you will be eligible for loan forgiveness to the extent of the costs indicated on this slide that you incur or pay during the 8 weeks following the loan date. That's a very important period. That 8 weeks following the date on which you actually get the loan, when it's dispersed to you, will be the measuring period for the costs that go into loan forgiveness. So those costs are payroll costs, mortgage interest, rent on leases, and utility payments. Now, a couple of caveats about those last three categories. The first is that although it's not in the CARES Act itself, the SBA has declared that no more than 25% of the forgiveness amount can be composed of non-payroll costs. So mortgage interest, rent, utility payments cannot constitute more than 25% of your forgiveness amount. The second note is that if you look at the previous slide that Bernie gave you in terms of the amounts that are allowable to be used, you will see there's no time limit on when those costs were incurred. However, in the forgiveness amount, you can only use amounts that were the obligation existed before February 15th. So what the government essentially is saying is, look, we will loan you the money to pay mortgage interest, rent, utility payments whenever incurred. But if you want forgiveness, they have to be things that were already in existence. You can't go out and create new obligations and expect to get forgiveness for the amount you spend on those. Now, remember that the purpose of the Payroll Protection Program is to keep people employed and to support their pay. Therefore, there are certain things that if the borrower does them, the amount that will be forgiven will be reduced. There will be a limit on the amount of forgiveness. Those two things are reduction in workforce and reduction in pay. So let's talk first about the workforce reduction. This is again measured during the 8-week period. And what happens is you create a fraction and then you apply that fraction to the amount of forgiveness that you've already calculated to determine how much of the forgiveness remains available to you. That fraction, the numerator of that fraction consists of the average number of monthly full-time equivalent employees during the 8-week period. The denominator of the fraction is the average monthly number of FTEs for one of two earlier periods. And the borrower can choose which of those two periods it wants to use. Those two earlier periods are either February 15th to June 30th of last year, 2019, or the first 2 months of this year. The employer is going to want to choose between those two periods the period that had the least number of FTEs. And let's just walk through an example to show you why. Let's suppose that during the 8-week period after you get the loan, your average number of FTEs is 75. And let's suppose during the period of last year, the measurement period of February 15th to June 30, the average number of FTEs was 100. That would mean your fraction would be 75 over 100, or 75%, and you would multiply your forgiveness amount by that 75% to determine a reduction. So if your forgiveness amount was otherwise going to be $1 million, but your fraction was 75%, you would only be entitled to forgiveness of $750,000. Now let's suppose that in the first 2 months of this year, the average monthly number of FTEs was 75. Your fraction then would be 75 over 75, or 100%, and there would be no reduction in the forgiveness amount based on average number of FTEs. So again, this is a pro rata reduction based on a comparison. The second action that can result in reduction of forgiveness and limitation of forgiveness is a reduction in salary or wages. What the Act says that if there is a reduction or salary of salary or wages during the 8-week period of more than 25%, there will be a dollar for dollar reduction of the forgiveness amount. So again, whereas the previous slide, the reduction was a pro rata reduction, this is a dollar for dollar reduction that looks at each employee, but it only applies to employees making not more than $100,000 annually. And there's even an additional caveat on that. The Act says that it applies only to reductions for an employee who did not receive in any single pay period in 2019 wages or salary at a rate in excess of $100,000, and that's curious language. So let's suppose you have an employee who's making $1,000 a week, $52,000 per year, and you're paying your payroll is twice a month. That person is getting 26 payrolls of $2,000 apiece. Now let's suppose you paid that employee a $2,000 bonus at the end of the year. In that final pay period, that person would have received their regular $2,000 salary payment or wage payment, plus the $2,000 bonus for a total of $4,000. Well, $4,000 times 26 pay periods is a rate of $104,000 a year. Therefore, it appears, based on the language in the Act, that any reduction to that person's salary would be totally disregarded in determining whether or not you had to take a reduction in the forgiveness amount. That may not seem consistent with the purpose and the spirit of the Act, but that is the way the Act is worded. So it's another area that we're going to look for some additional clarification. Another question about this salary reduction is the starting point for determining a reduction. The Act says it applies to a reduction during the 8-week period, and it doesn't compare the rates of salary. It talks about the absolute amount. So the question is, could you reduce salary just before you got the loan, not make any reductions during the term of the loan, the 8-week period, and not have any reduction for salary reduction, not have any limitation on loan forgiveness? That might be true, but there is a limitation on that I will talk about in just a minute. So one of the things to notice about this salary reduction, wage reduction, is that there is a difference in the periods. You're comparing the 8-week period with the previous quarter. By the way, I may not have mentioned this, but the question of 25% compared to what? It's compared to the previous quarter. So you're comparing an 8-week period with a 12-week period, which means the 25% number for the previous period is actually going to be larger than 25% of the 8-week period. So that actually may give you a little more leeway in determining how much of reduction you can engage in. Okay, now you say to yourself, well, look, I'm in trouble already because I've already laid off people or I've already reduced compensation. Therefore, I know I'm not going to get full forgiveness. Well, maybe not. The Act also says that staff reductions made between February 15th and April 26th of this year, and compensation reductions made between February 15th and April 26th of this year will be disregarded if you reverse the effect of those by June 30th. And by the way, the significance of April 26th is simply that it's 30 days after the CARES Act was adopted. So you might look at that and say, wow, that's great. I can avoid the problem with forgiveness, and maybe there's a loophole here. I can lay off my whole staff And then as long as I bring them back by June 29th, I can use the loan and not have paid them, and I won't have a reduction in forgiveness. Well, that's technically true, but it's too clever by half. Because remember, all we're talking about now is reducing the amount of your forgiveness. But the basic amount of your forgiveness in the first instance is dependent on the qualified costs. And the biggest element of those costs is payroll costs. It has to be at least 75% of the forgiveness amount. So if you're not paying employees during the 8-week period, then you're not going to have the raw material, as it were, to get loan forgiveness. So while that might appear to be a loophole in the act, in practical terms, it probably is not, because you won't be creating the payroll costs that you need in the first place in order to get loan forgiveness. In terms of the process for getting forgiveness, it won't happen until after June 30. Specific documentation will be required to support that. So you'll have to provide payroll records, you have to provide rent receipts, etc. The decision will be made by your lender. Because of the volume of this program, the SBA has had to delegate the application and the responsibility for interpreting this to the lenders themselves. There's just too much volume for the SBA to try to go loan by loan. So your lender will decide whether your application for forgiveness is granted, and they're supposed to make that decision within 60 days after receipt of the application for forgiveness. The question will be whether, due to the huge volume of these things, the lenders will be able to meet that period. The next bullet point here, the third bullet point in this slide, is very important. Normally, if you have debt forgiven, you have to recognize taxable income. It's considered the same as if someone gave you money, which you would have to declare as income, and then you use that money to pay down the debt. The CARES Act, however, says that amounts forgiven under this program will not constitute cancellation of debt income, will not be included in gross income. So that's very good news. You can have loans forgiven and not worry about having a negative tax effect for that factor. Now, we expect to get more direction from the SBA as this goes along. There already have been several things that have come out. The SBA issued a memo on April 2nd. It issued an FAQ that it has updated several times. It was originally issued on the 7th. I think it's been updated as recently as yesterday. So there is continuing interpretation coming out of the government with respect to the program. If you don't get loan forgiveness, what happens? Well, it's a loan. This table shows you what the CARES Act says in terms of the parameters for the loan and what the SBA has actually decided. The CARES Act said the loan term will be not more than 10 years. The SBA has said the term will be 2 years. The CARES Act says interest of no more than 4% per annum. The SBA says it will be 1% per annum. Principal and interest will be deferred also, payment for at least 6 months following the end of the period, the 8-week period. A couple of issues that I'm going to conclude with to note. The first is the mismatch in periods. So you might be thinking, well, look, I'm going to keep my payroll the same. I'm going to keep my workforce in the same number. I'm going to keep my pay rates the same. Therefore, I will easily qualify for forgiveness just by the fact that I'm not going to change what I'm paying people. That's not necessarily true, because remember, in calculating your loan amount, as Bernie told you, you're entitled to use 2.5 times your monthly payroll costs. 2.5 times the monthly payroll cost is essentially 2.5 months of payroll, or approximately 10 weeks. But the period to measure your qualifying expenditures for forgiveness is only 8 weeks. So even if you keep everything the same, you're likely going to have a gap in your forgiveness amount simply because you're comparing 8 weeks to 10 weeks. And remember also that your non-payroll expenses like rent and utilities, which you can use to soak up some of that gap, can't be more than 25% of the total forgiveness. One other note, taxes. So if you look, and this has caused a lot of confusion among a lot of commentators and other people, the definition of payroll costs says that it excludes, payroll costs do not include FICA and income tax withholding during the period from February 15th to June 30th of this year. What does that mean? So a number of commentators have looked at that and says, well, I guess that means that when you go to forgiveness, You have to back out the taxes that you withheld from your payroll costs. You could only get forgiveness for the net amounts that you paid your employees, not for the amounts that you withheld for taxes. That doesn't seem to make any sense when you think about the spirit of the act. And luckily, the SBA's frequently asked questions document appears to say that no exclusion is necessary for those items. The only thing you exclude is the employer portion of FICA, which you wouldn't be able to include anyway as a payroll cost. But FICA and income tax withholding, federal income tax withholding at the source is not required to be backed out. We'll get some additional clarification on that, but that appears to be the case now. I'm going to shoot this back to Bernie so he can talk about the process for getting a PPP loan.
Thanks, Justin. So 3 pillars from a practical standpoint that we are advising clients. What do I do? Cut out the legal jargon. Bernie, what the heck do we do? How do we get this loan? Again, 3 pillars. 1, contact your lawyers if you haven't done it already. Again, they can provide guidance on this stuff, just as Justin and I have been going through this, give you some feedback to make sure you're in the best position possible to dot your I's and cross your T's, both in getting the loan and in using the loan appropriately and setting yourself up to have the best chance at getting the quote free money, the forgiveness. You should also at the same time be working with your CPA and bookkeepers. You're going to need to compile that information to be sure that 12-month, all those payroll costs, start getting that stuff done if you haven't done it already. And then 3, and this may be the most important, not to disparage the lawyers and the CPAs, but you got to find a bank who's going to get this across the finish line for you. And that has been perhaps the trickiest part of this entire program. We're starting to see some light and some clarity and a little bit more efficiency, but it's gotten off to a rocky start. We have a number of clients who have long established banking relations with some of the big lenders out there, and they were not able to get their application in. And in some cases, they were specifically said, hey, we can't help you, go to someone else. Wild and crazy. I've seen the emails from some pretty well-known banks saying, hey, thanks, you're a great customer, but we just can't process your application. So I always say start with your existing bank relationship, reach out to a human being and see if you can get their attention and get them to manually help you across the finish line to take your app. But get clarity, can you help me or not? If they can't, I would recommend probably right now trying to find a small or local bank. For whatever reason, you've heard of Bank of America and Chase and some of the numbers they've been doing, but through yesterday, the smaller local community banks have actually accounted for more than half of the applications, not just processed, but approved and paid. So the smaller local banks are actually having a little bit more success in terms of getting this into the end zone and getting folks their money. Some folks have gotten their application in 10 plus days ago, and they're still waiting for it. Some folks got their application in on Thursday or Friday of last week, and I talked to 4 of our clients yesterday, and they got the money. It hit their account yesterday. So there's an aspect of luck to it, but also finding just a good lender. And it's changing by the hour, folks. Some of the bigger banks finally seem to be getting their you-know-what together. But again, if you have not reached out to any bank yet, I would 1, go to your existing bank and see if they can help you immediately. But 2, if they can't help you, find a local or community bank, reach out, make a few phone calls at the same time, see who gives you the best feedback, gives you the best hand-holding, and try to get that in as quickly as possible. What you'll submit is pretty simple in that regard. An SBA, they have circulated a draft application about a week and a half ago. They updated it, but it's a 2-page document. And they're trying to remove as much red tape as possible. Particularly the banks aren't doing any amount of due diligence, at least substantively. Lying, and this comes from the act, you as the borrower are going to self-certify on the front end and on the back end. So you're going to self-certify on the honor system that you qualify and that you're eligible. You are going to self-certify and represent that these are your payroll costs. And the bank is going to rely in large part on you. They'll process it, get it to the SBA, and see if they can process and get you your money quickly. There will be some checks and balances at some point, and that would most likely come in the forgiveness aspect of it or after June 30th. But the main focus right now is they've gotten a lot of flack that it has been slow and it has been rocky. So they're really trying to speed this process up to get the money into the business's hands. And they're using these self-certification as one of the primary tools to do that. And as Justin pointed to, when you do go for forgiveness, you're going to have to self-certify. You're going to have to go and provide that documentation, those pay rates, the IRS stuff. Verify that you actually use the money for what you're saying you're using it for. But again, if you have not talked to your lawyers, your CPAs, or your bank, do it now. A lot of the money is now accounted for, but it has not run out yet. They may add more to it. So if you've already submitted an application, congratulations. A lot of you folks who have submitted it have had a lot of follow-up questions on forgiveness and that component on it because the money's starting to hit. We can help in that regard. But if you have not gotten it started yet, what are you waiting for? Give yourself a chance. So now I want to move in and rope in Brett Miller from our labor and employment group. This is the practical employment questions, okay? We've got 4 here, and certainly you may have more, and we'll try to address them as quickly as possible in the presentation today. But Brett, one of the first big question we have is, hey, this PPP loan sounds great, but I've already furloughed and laid people off. If I've done that, what's the whole point of trying to apply for it? Am I disqualified from getting a CARES Act PPP loan if I've already let people go or if I've already furloughed them? And how have you handled that question?
Yeah, it's a common question, Bernie. And no, you're not disqualified from getting the loan if you've already laid people off. It really has nothing to do with your qualifications for getting that money in the first place. What it could affect if you don't bring people back is the forgiveness, as Justin was walking through that formula and the 75% requirement from the SBA to make sure that 75% of those loan proceeds go to payroll. So as a practical matter, and from the way the law is written, they want you to bring people back on payroll, even if there's no work for them, bring them back on payroll as soon as possible so you can maximize your loan forgiveness and, keep people paid.
So Secretary Mnuchin was on TV the other week and he said, hey, hire people back now and we'll pay for it. Look, cash flow is a reality. It's an issue. For the companies out there, and certainly the companies on this call, if they've applied for the loan, they don't have the cash yet. Do they have to hire them back today? Or can they wait until the money's actually given to them? Maybe it's next week they get the money. Can they wait to hire them back and still qualify for the full forgiveness?
Yeah, they can wait. I mean, companies have to do what they have to do now with like you said, the cash crunch. And the loan forgiveness formula starts, that 8-week period starts from the date of loan proceeds. So if you need to furlough, if you need to, have people off work now, that's fine. That may be necessary, but the law and the forgiveness aspect really kicks in once you get that money, and you got to kind of bring people back on payroll as soon as possible. Is the spirit of that law.
I want to jump down to number 4. And we're talking about Michigan and the governor. She issued her second executive order last Thursday. Depending on where you're at in the construction field, you might be deemed a critical infrastructure company. You might not be. For those who have at least read the order and deem themselves to be closed, they can't do any work. They can't go build that house. They can't go do that kitchen. They have to basically put everybody on the sidelines and they're frankly out of business. Do those companies still qualify for the loan? They got employees who they've had to lay off or would have to lay off because they're not doing any work. How the heck can they use this money to keep paying their people even though they're not doing anything? What's the answer to that?
Yes, they can. Again, it's designed to keep people on payroll. The government is essentially offering to pay businesses to pay their people As long as they're on payroll, it doesn't matter if they're under a stay-at-home isolation order. It doesn't matter if there's no work for them to do. You keep them on payroll. That's the purpose. So, you know, with CAM members, we may have some who have essential businesses and they have some or all of their people working. Others may have, you know, have to be sitting on the sidelines because of the stay-at-home order. It doesn't matter. It's the same principle. Bring people back on payroll, whether there's work or not. Keep them paid and then maximize your chances for forgiveness.
Gotcha. So I want to jump to number 3. And this was a big hot topic. This was one of the points that they tried to address, but they, you know, certain Republican senators couldn't get it done. But their question was, wait a minute, it's possible that we could have employees making more money on unemployment than they were with us. I think it was South Carolina. The average was to be on the unemployment line, you'd pay $4 an hour. So let's say, you know, one of the webinar folks, they apply for the loan, they get the loan. Let's say they get it tomorrow. They send out a note to all their employees, calling them back and saying, hey, I got the loan, I'm going to pay you, come back. And you may have a number of employees who say, man, I don't want to come back because I'm making more money doing nothing, being unemployed, than I would going to work for you. And maybe they don't want to come back. How have you been guiding employers to deal with that practical issue? They've got the loan, they want to get the forgiveness, and there's certain folks who would rather stay unemployed. What's the guidance you give employers?
Yeah, it's a great point, because it's not just they're making, you know, $24 an hour sitting at home. Some of them are also afraid to come back to work, or they have, you know, they're claiming they're high risk, or they have family members who are high risk. So they're just willing to kind of take the chance or a pay cut, whatever it may be, and sit at home and take the $600 from the Fed plus the $362 per week from the state. So the advice you can really give is, you know, look, there's work for you, or we're putting you back on payroll even if there's not work for you. If you refuse, you know, we have to honestly tell the unemployment insurance agency that there is work that we are paying you, and that you have essentially voluntarily foregone those paychecks and that benefit, which could impact your unemployment. You know, you can't promise they're not going to get unemployment because you don't control that. The unemployment agency does. But you can, you know, honestly let those companies know that you're going to be telling unemployment that they have the chance to be on payroll, and then it's up to them to say, okay, well, this risks my chance to get unemployment and this nice benefit from this extra $600 from the feds, or I could sit here and have my payroll, have my benefits maintained, you know, all the advantages they get from staying on payroll. You know, all they have to do is come back to work. So that's kind of the best advice we can give, but it's a big problem. We're having a lot of employees just, for whatever reason, refuse to come back to work, and you know, everybody wants to maximize that loan forgiveness, so it behooves everyone to try to get them back on payroll.
Along those same lines, and I got a question here, I'll just ask it right now because it fits right into this. Maybe this is more practical than legal, but I know you've been dealing with this. Let's say you bring everybody back on, but you've got some of the essential folks and you got some folks who aren't essential. You got to pay the people to sit at home who aren't essential, and they're getting paid to do nothing. And then you have the employees who are deemed essential. They're getting paid the same amount, and they actually have to work. So sometimes there's a camaraderie, a morale issue, a fairness complaint that, hey, I'm working and this person isn't, and we're getting paid the same. Any insight into what other businesses or employers have done to address that issue, or what they can do?
That's a complicated question. You know, if you are part of, you know, if you have a union, there's a bargaining agreement aspect to this. There's a lot of talk about hazard pay. And some clients will say, look, we're going to pay our people who have to work, they're essential, a little extra. And the people who stay home, then, you know, they're making more than the people who are sitting home getting paid, and that makes them happy. If you have a bargaining agreement, you know, you have to bargain that with the union, which can be a pain. So there's a lot of moving parts to that. Other companies simply rely on, look, this is what it is. You're coming back to work. Our attendance policies are going to be enforced, and they don't offer the quote unquote hazard pay. So it's either the carrot or the stick approach that most clients are taking as a practical matter. And it depends on your business, your workforce. Companies know their people best and how they want to handle it. But that's typically the approaches we've seen.
Another common question, and then we'll get into other questions, but this is kind of the final one on this point is, before this CARES Act phase 3, as they've been calling it, was implemented, there was the Family First Coronavirus Resource Act and those new paid leave laws. Can you just quickly touch on and reconcile the obligations and what they did with the FFCRA and how that reconciles with the CARES Act itself?
Yeah, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act set forth 2 new leave laws that apply to employers under 500 employees. And it had a whole mechanism for how this paid leave would be provided to employees and reimbursed by the government, which the companies can get the money back through payroll tax withholding. And if that doesn't cover the leave benefit, companies can apply for an additional tax credit. So when the CARES Act passed, the legislatures were thinking, well, if you're already getting money back from the government using this mechanism through payroll tax withholding for people on leave, and you're using PPP money to pay for it, that's double dipping. So the CARES Act expressly says you can't do that. You got to use FFCRA process to get money back for people on that leave. You can't use PPP money to go towards that, so you can't double dip. It's a bit of an accounting headache since money's fungible, but that's the way the law came down, so that you're not really getting that double benefit from these stimulus laws.
Great. All right, so I want to quickly go through these slides. If you don't qualify for the CARES Act for whatever reason, are there other options as a small or maybe mid-sized business that doesn't qualify? And yes, the answer is yes. Okay. There are some other SBA options in the state of Michigan. We're happy to address those offline. Certainly some lower amounts of money. That's not the free money, but there are other programs and options to a smaller extent that you can have access to. There's also the EIDL program where you can get the $10,000 to $15,000, although that program has been off to a rocky start as well. Certainly nothing that even comes close, at least in my opinion, to the free money feel and messaging that you get under a PPP loan. There's also, if you're over that 500 threshold or otherwise don't qualify, there is an option under the CARES Act for mid-sized businesses between 5 and 10,000 employees. It's not the free money, the forgivable money, but you can get a loan with an interest rate not higher than 2% and some other benefits, including not paying interest or principal. You can get access to funds and apply for those, but there are some catches, some strings attached. And I frankly have not seen one client yet who has wanted to go for this loan. Here's a few list of bullet points of the strings that are attached, including no outsourcing, offshoring jobs, abrogation to CBAs, and neutrality in union organizing. Those are just poison pills, in our opinion. But if you'd like to talk about that or explore that, we can certainly do that with you offline. And again, we've talked about our CARES Act team, again, A to Z in terms of the types of areas we can jump in on. A number of those folks are on this call. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Mike Decker and we can take some more questions.
Thanks, Bernie. Yeah, we're going to just address a few questions that we received prior to the presentation today, and then we've been receiving a few during the live chat. So the first question that we received was, and Brett, I think this one's for you, and I think you somewhat addressed it already, but we can address it again. The question is, we have essential work and employees are refusing to come to work and collecting unemployment. What to do?
Yeah, Mike, I think that goes back to the thought of the carrot or the stick approach. And a lot of companies are sort of just taking the position that, look, we got to tell unemployment that we're putting you on payroll and you're refusing, and that could jeopardize your benefit. And, it's not really a threat. You have a legal duty to honestly respond to unemployment. So it just kind of is what it is. And companies can kind of tailor their messaging, but that's really the best approach.
Second question is, would you consider expanding the executive order to make employers in operation during this pandemic to check the temperatures of employees before each shift? I think, Brett, you're going to take that one too.
And I'll take that. So depending on where you're located or where you're operating, there may already be, Oakland County, Wayne County have local orders suggesting taking temperatures. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has come out and said that while normally without a global pandemic, taking temperatures of people in the workplace could be a kind of violation of disability laws, they've waived that during the pandemic and said it's okay. So while the executive order at this point doesn't necessarily mandate it, the preparedness plan that one of the latest executive orders requires employers to have certainly would have at least questions about temperature. If you have a temperature, if you feel feverish, if you've traveled, things like that you want to ask or have the employees disclose. And within that, there's nothing preventing you from taking temperatures if the company wants to set forth that rule as part of its policy or plan.
And Mike, can I jump in on that real quick? And this is, the executive order came out last Thursday, and it requires, and this is important for everybody on this webinar, it requires you, even if you are a stay-at-home business right now, but you have some people, even the basic middle operation people going on site for however small it is, it requires you to have this prepared written response plan put now. We have been helping clients prepare these plans. It's about 5 or 6 pages of documents that we've been helping a bunch of other clients doing. So if you have not prepared a preparedness and response plan to this crisis, which includes this specific issue, you need to do that. You are required to do that. And again, our team can help. So if you haven't done that yet, Mike, they can reach out to you or anybody on this chain, and we can help shep that through for them.
Thanks, Bernie. Third question, and I think this is for Justin. How will the amount of loan forgiveness be determined? The question goes on to say, our headcount and payroll are down from last year's monthly average, as well as from January and February average this year. If the 8-week clock starts ticking from the date of disbursement, we may get most people back to work. We may get most people back to work until the stay-at-home orders are lifted and until our customers allow us back.
So I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but the loan forgiveness, as we've said, is determined by the amount that you spend on the qualified categories, which are payroll costs, mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. That are the last 3 categories. If they existed, the obligation existed before February 15th, at least 75% of that has to be payroll costs. So as Brett has pointed out, the point of getting these loans is to pay people even if they're not actually working. If you're shut down, not at work, you still pay these people to create the payroll costs that'll go into forgiveness. If you take the loan and you don't bring people back and you're not paying them, then you're not going to have the costs to go into the forgiveness calculation to determine how much gets forgiven.
Great, thanks. And then the fourth question that we received prior to the presentation, I think you're going to take this one, Bernie, and I believe you've already addressed a little bit, but it says, besides the PPP loan grant, is there any other funds available that would be allowed to coincide with the PPP?
Right, and that's where the EIDL program comes in, and that's another bucket of money, albeit very small, 10 to 15 grand that you can get your hands on. There's certainly Michigan SBA programs. That has been difficult, been a slight disaster. But those are available. And again, the mid-sized businesses, there is an availability of good terms on the loan. But again, with all those strings attached, I just don't know that that's something that folks would seriously want to consider. But If you don't qualify for the PPP for whatever reason, or even if you do and you're EIDL or some other monetary components, there's a payroll cost aspect to the CARES Act, we can certainly talk about that offline.
Great. And then let's move to some of the live chat questions just because of time constraints. I know we've only got about 5 minutes left here, but so one of our questions was, and I'll open this up to Bernie, Justin, or Brett to answer. It says, can a 1099 employee be counted for payroll calculation?
Go ahead, Brett.
The answer is no.
Yeah, no.
1099 employees are independent contractors. They cannot be counted either in the number of employees or the payroll costs. They are entitled to apply for their own loans, but they cannot be included in an employer's payroll.
Okay, the next question is, can you elaborate on the NAICS codes as found on Michigan tax return page 1 that allow a business greater than 500 employees to still qualify? Where can we find what codes qualify?
I can take that. Any code under the NAICS could potentially qualify. Again, the CARES Act, I don't want to get too legalese here, but it really is an extension or an expansion of the existing Small Business Administration statute. So a whole bunch of rules and regulation and guidances previously apply, including this specific issue. There is a website that myself and a few members of our team have easy access to through the SBA called Size Standards, where if you find your code, you plug that in through your website and it spits out the number of employees that is deemed to be a small business under those affiliation rules. So it's not, the slide's not up right now, but I gave an example for a motor parts manufacturer. That was the definition of a code that another client had. They were about 550 employees. They found their 6-digit code, as you alluded to on that Michigan tax return. We took it through the website on the SBA. We plugged it in, and it ended up giving them, they were deemed to be a small business at 1,500 employees. So initially they thought they did not qualify. Once they plugged in their 6-digit code, depending on the category that they were in, a corresponding small business number was spit out, and they actually did qualify with under 1,500 employees, even though they were over the 500 mark. So again, if you can find your code, you could email us offline and we could help guide you through that quickly if you can't find the SBA website, and really give you comfort or confirmation whether you qualify or not. But it really is a kind of an easy plug and play through the SBA website and using that to determine your eligibility.
Great, thanks, Bernie. Next question is, are contributions to a retirement plan considered eligible payroll costs?
Justin, you want to tackle that?
I think the answer is yes, that retirement costs are included in the definition of payroll costs.
And I'll jump in here for construction industry. Be a little bit cautious about if you have bargaining unit union fringes, because not all fringes are going to be the healthcare or retirement costs that are expressly excluded in payroll costs. A lot of times with the bargaining agreement, you're paying these fringe benefits that include things like, apprenticeship fund, labor management contributions, industry advancement funds, all these very specific labor issues that are not part of the definition of payroll costs in the CARES Act. So healthcare, retirement, yes. Some of these other ancillary issues that get bundled up into the same kind of formula in union negotiations, those are a different beast.
Thanks, guys. And then let's just take one more, since we're at our time limit here. It says, I have laid off my employees, so do not have payroll, but would like to pay health insurance benefits with PPP while they are off. Is this a reasonable use and forgivable?
I'll take that. The answer is yes. health insurance benefits are included in payroll costs. So to the extent that you use PPP loans to pay that, you can include those in the forgiveness amounts. Obviously, if you're paying health benefits, but you're not paying other payroll costs, salary, wages, et cetera, the amount that you're going to have to put into that calculation is going to be reduced. So there's going to be a relationship depending on how much you take as a loan and how much you can get forgiven. But yes, health care benefits, health insurance benefits are included in payroll costs that can be included in your calculation to determine loan forgiveness.
Great, thanks, Justin.
Okay. Well, it looks like we're just about out of time. Thank you, Mike, for moderating our question and answer session. And thank you to everyone who joined the webinar. We apologize if we were not able to get to everyone's questions. Please reach out to the attorneys listed here on your screen if you have any follow-up questions. A copy of this presentation will be made available this afternoon on the Butzel.com webinar event page and the Butzel Coronavirus Resource Center. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you presenters, and have a great day.